Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending to this session. As you will notice, the title of my presentation is already different from the one on the program. And what I want to highlight with this title is that this presentation is very exploratory, and I hope it raises questions about policy. And it's by no means a research papers as the previous ones, so the interest, in my opinion, of this presentation is about hopefully creating some insightful policy discussion. This is, as I mentioned at the very end, but this is an exploratory work that I'm leading with Rodrigo from UNU-WIDER, Rodrigo Oliveira, and Bernard Tempo from Zambian economist. As is presented in the title, it's all about carbon taxes in low and middle income countries, and hopefully a few insights from Zambia. What's the idea? The big picture is that obviously climate change, and every of the presenters has started like this, is a global challenge. It's a global challenge, but that is going to impact more southern economies and the same economies that are more vulnerable to these shocks. So this is just as an illustration, introductory figures. This is from the famous paper of Tama Carlton and our co-authors. And what you can see here is the supplementary number of deaths for 100,000 of inhabitants by 2100, according to a very good model that they built. And what you see, for example, is that according to their model in Ghana, in Accra, we would experience an increase of 160 supplementary deaths due to climate change by the end of the century, which is exactly the gain of the reduction in death that would be experienced by a capital like Berlin in Germany. So just to say that this is a global challenge, and the South is expected to be obviously more impacted and is also already more vulnerable. A question within that big environmental discussion that we're having also in the developing world is, can low and middle income countries adopt carbon pricing instruments to foster what's been called sustainable growth, or in the environmental sense of it? Is it an efficient tool? And there are interests from the international community in also trying to fund green projects in the South, and there is also an interest from policymakers. So is this, how realistic is this? And this is the kind of questions I want to open with this discussion. Recent evidence from high-income countries are pretty positive, in the sense that there is a very good paper, in my opinion, from John Coleman and his co-author published in 2025, showing that the European carbon market, EU ETS, didn't harm growth for European firms, and even helped under certain conditions. Is this the case for poor and middle-income countries? Is that true, or are there specificities that we should pay special attention to? Obviously, it's going to be different. It's very likely to be different for distributional aspects, and also to do not harm competitiveness in order to do not harm economic development. What I will do here, in the 10 minutes that I have left, 8 to be precise, it's just questions and preliminary evidence from Zambia. I'll just say a word because I have only 8 minutes left when I think about it, but so there is a strong support also among policymakers for carbon taxation. The thing is, it's rarely implemented, right? If we look at the carbon pricing dashboard by the World Bank, in the southern part of the globe, very few countries, if I can express it like this, took the risk to implement carbon pricing mechanisms. The reasons for that is that there are important constraints, there are big concerns about competitiveness and the distributional aspects and effects of those carbon pricing mechanisms. And we have very little empirical evidence, because of the very little implementation, of those effects already in high-income countries, but even more in low-income countries. And this is why I think that Edson's papers and co-authors is very important. Is going to be a very important paper, because this is one of the first, in my opinion, a good study of carbon market implementation in the context of developing economy. Key to this implementation is how the revenue is being used and how the money is being recycled through the economy. Those two co-authors, Timil Sina and Sebzidi, did a study of a CGE model with 19 sectors in Ethiopia to study the implementation of a $20 carbon tax on fossil fuels, specifically only on the fossil fuel sector in Ethiopia. And what they find is that, obviously, the results of whether this could be good or bad for the Ethiopian economy and for the Ethiopian environment is highly sensitive on the assumptions that are being made on the redistribution of the revenue. The carbon tax, under some conditions, could increase GDP when the revenue is recycled to cut personal income tax. But they note that the gains are still very small. And they raise a lot of questions with the size of the informal economy, saying that because of the size of the informal economy, maybe actually it would be practically impossible to obtain the gains that they estimate with their CGE models. As a second paper, I was going to cite the presentation of Edson and their findings showing that there's no negative effects on sales and capital employment and profits. This is all encouraging. How about Zambia? Let me say a word about Zambia. I think this talk makes the link between the two previous presentations because Oli presented us a lot about the context. What I would just say is that we are talking relative to South Africa. For those in the room that are not familiar with Zambia, which I wasn't before this project with my two co-authors, is that this is more than half of the labor force that is still in agriculture. Electricity is mostly hydro-based, as discussed previously. That means that the electricity sector in Zambia is not emitting a lot of carbon per unit of output relative to a country, relative to Poland, say. So that's a very important point for thinking about carbon taxing. And as we saw presentations all day today, the copper sector is very important in the economy. Another piece of facts that I would like to bring is these two graphs. On the left-hand side, you have the CO2 emissions per capita. And what I did compare it to is South Africa, that we just saw an example of a carbon market, the world, and Africa as a world group. You can see that Zambia is emitting way less than the other group that you have here. In terms of CO2 emissions per unit of output, it's exactly the same figure. It's the right-hand side of the panel here, and Zambia is below the level of Africa. So one first point from this is that the level of pollution in Zambia is not high. By any means, this is not high. And this is important when we want to think about taxing pollution. I think this is important. The sources of emissions by sector from the Climate Watch datasets are the following one. Agriculture is by far the most emitting sector, with more than half of the population in the agricultural sector. So, with these facts in mind, what do you do with the 5 minutes I have left? What do you do and what we've been doing as exploratory work? We've been using the IFPRI data on SAM for Zambia from 2019, and we coupled it with the emission data from the Climate Watch dataset, and we used the simplest tool available to us before using a CGE model, is a static multiplier model. We consider a tax only in a carbon tax only in some sectors K. So the output is Y. T0 is the indirect taxes that are already affecting sector K, and TE is the carbon tax. We simulate the case of a carbon tax in the chemicals and petroleum sector and in the electricity sector. We don't touch agriculture for obvious reasons that would threaten food insecurity, etc., etc. And I will show just two quick results. And to explain those results, this equation is important. In the SAM multiplier price model, the change in the price model due to the tax has two components. You can see, and I will have to move, I'm sorry, but this is the tax effect. So this is the tax that we are going to simulate times the emission intensity of sector K. And this is how much of inputs from other sectors J is being used by sector K, and times the change in price in other sectors J because of the adjustments to the tax. Okay? And the same goes for the consumer price index. What do we find? We do two things. We test very low level of carbon taxes, between $4 and $10 per ton of CO2 emissions for both sectors that I mentioned. And at the end, we do one thought exercise when we put the tax on all sectors to see what would be the amount of fiscal space that we would gain. I have literally 2 minutes left, so what I would like to emphasize is that the effects are very small, according to our multiplier. For the tax on chemicals and petroleum, we find that the producers' prices would change by, at most, in the mining sector, by something by 0.1%, not more than that at the beginning. But this is the lowest impact. Here, if we tax electricity, because electricity is being used by more, the share of electricity as an input across sector is larger than the previous sector that I showed you. We still find very modest impact, but we find an increase of, for example, in the mining sector, of the producer price index by 0.7%. But these are modest changes, right? If we try to look at how much the carbon tax would generate in terms of fiscal space relative to the current indirect tax, we, except obviously for the agricultural sector, which emits a lot, we always fall short relative to what current indirect tax are generating. That doesn't mean this is useless, but that means that it's still little, and it comes from the fact that Zambia is not emitting a lot of CO2 emissions, right? To conclude, I would like to finish that with the fact that that carbon pricing idea is also an idea of how to adapt to climate change. And Zambia has been thinking about it, and this is something I learned thanks to this project, at least since 2014, when was launched the National Adaptation Plan to lower vulnerability to climate change with a lot of different measures. The main fundings of this National Adaptation Plans comes from domestic resources, in the international support, and private sector investment. If carbon pricing can be used as a way to increase the fundings by international investment in this National Adaptation Plan, maybe that could be not such a bad idea, given all the limits that I did mention already before. I have literally 0 minutes left, so I would like just to insist on that bullet point here. This is completely agnostic reflections, but could the carbon tax, if well designed, replace part of the existing indirect taxes that are implemented in Zambia, for example, to fund that National Adaptation Plan specifically to cope against climate shocks? Perhaps this could be an idea. I don't know. But maybe a stronger international support in terms of financial transfers might be needed, and not necessarily in the form of implementing a carbon tax, but I let policymakers decide of this. Thank you very much.